Welcome to the Quincy Institute's panel titled Whither Trump's Iran Deal. My name is Sridhar Parsia. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward rigorous diplomacy. We favor a national security strategy that is centered on diplomatic engagement and military restraint. Nuclear talks with Iran have progressed in some aspects further in 3 months under Trump than it did under 4 years of Biden. Yet mixed messages from the Trump administration regarding his key objectives and his red lines have now dampened a lot of that earlier optimism. Steve Witkov recently stated that Trump's red line is not weaponization, but actually enrichment as a whole, prompting strong responses from Iran and now potentially risking that the next meeting that was scheduled to happen this weekend may not happen at all as a result of Iran's objections. Trump has promised that very bad things will happen if a deal is not struck. But can he secure a deal if he insists on demands that Iran has vowed to never accept and that experience shows is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to get the Iranians to accept prior to those bad things actually happening? To discuss these dynamics, we are joined by 3 of the most incisive voices on Iranian foreign policy and U.S. strategy in the Middle East. Professor Vali Nasr of Johns Hopkins University, Professor Mohsen Milani of the University of South Florida, and Ellie Geranmayeh of the European Council on Foreign Relations. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, you can use the Q&A function to ask your questions. And those who are watching on YouTube or Facebook or other platforms, if you put your question in the comment sections, we will try to get to those as well. So with no further ado, let me introduce our esteemed panelists. Vali Nasr is a professor of international affairs and Middle East studies at Johns Hopkins School of International Studies, SAIS. From 2012 to 2019, he was the dean of that school. And from 2009 to 2011, he was a senior advisor to U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, Richard Holbrooke. His excellent new book that will come out this month, Iran's Grand Strategy, A Political History, is an absolute must read. And I will do a book talk with Vali on that very topic, on his book, on June 10th. So make sure that you tune into that as well. Secondly, we have Professor Mohsen Milani of the University of South Florida. He has authored over 80 publications on Iranian politics and foreign policy. He also has a new book out, Iran's Rise and Rivalry with the U.S. in the Middle East. It's also an absolute must-read. And I will also do a book talk with him on June 24th. So please pencil that in right away as well. And finally, we have Ellie Geranmayeh, who is the Deputy Head of the Middle East and North Africa Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She specializes in European foreign policy concerning Iran, focusing on nuclear negotiations and sanctions policy. She is without a doubt one of the most insightful analysts on Europe's thinking on Iran, which of course in this episode is tremendously important. So let me start with you, Vali. We have a situation in which at first Trump comes in, talks about only pursuing the red line of no weaponization, is actually quite disciplined in hammering that message as the only red line. But in the last couple of weeks, we seem to have seen some changes in which Trump's position appears to have gravitated back to what the Israelis were advocating for earlier on, a battle that they apparently lost, and what John Bolton and Pompeo were advocating back in Trump's first presidency. How do you explain this reverting back to something that clearly had not worked for Trump before? Is it just a negotiating tactic? Is it his real red line? And if it's just a negotiating tactic, what are the risks that come with using this as a negotiating tactic?
So first of all, thank you very much for inviting us to this panel. And it's great to be with Ellie and Mohsen here as well. You're correct. At the beginning, it looked like the talks are going very rapidly. In fact, President Trump was very forthright in the fact that he wants a deal. He doesn't want war, and he very clearly said no to Israeli pressure to dispense with diplomatic process altogether and go straight to bombing Iran's nuclear facilities. But since then, there has been a lot of problems. First of all, his team, to start with, was not even ready for talks. It took up to about the third meeting for them to have any concrete sense of what are the terms, what is the schedule for implementation, what are they willing to agree and not agree to. And then there has been this back and forth between, yes, Iran can have some enrichment, but not weaponization, or that it cannot have any enrichment at all. And in fact, Steve Witkov is on record saying both of these things. Partly, the talks went forward because what the Trump administration was saying publicly, it was not saying it privately. It privately was saying the opposite. If that's the reason why we are where we are this far. So it's possible that this is just a public posture. And we shall see that if they meet with Iranians again, whether they would put this red line on the table. Now, the danger here is that first of all, it signals a kind of confusion on the part of the Trump administrations. If you're not clear about the basic parameters, then talks cannot go forward. Secondly, it raises the issue of distrust among Iranians who have already been jilted once by U.S. walking away from a deal, meaning that the U.S.'s position can change, not just before they talk, but even after there's a deal, he could change his mind. Thirdly, it suggests that there is a lot of fighting going on in Washington, which also doesn't give Iranians a sense of comfort that the administration hasn't got its ducks in a row and is listening to different camps. And finally, I don't think it's very productive for the Trump administration to be conducting diplomacy in public with view to its base or to assuaging the neoconservative faction. These are the conversations should be had behind closed doors, not in public, because every time they speak, they create a public pressure inside Iran on the negotiators as well. Then they have to react to it. They have to say certain things that then will complicate things for Washington as well. So if we continue down this path, we're going to be at an impasse.
A quick follow-up on that. The Witkov team apparently did mention or insist on zero enrichment in the last round of talks. If the next round takes place and there is no movement on this issue and it becomes more clear to the Iranians that this appears to be the American position, not perhaps fully convinced, but nevertheless going in that direction, how many more rounds do you think can take place without this issue getting fully clarified? Are we at a risk of this collapsing just in the next 2 or 3 weeks?
Well, we could think of this round collapsing, because I fundamentally don't think President Trump wants war. And as a result, if he puts this choice on the table, he creates a black and white situation for himself. But it's possible it might end up being like the Russia-Ukraine situation. This round fails, there's a lull, there's tensions. We may end up even at Snapback threat by October. But I think unless the two sides are ready to go to war, they're going to re-engage again.
Ellie, if I could turn to you. In the American setting, I think we have a clear picture that Trump really wants a deal, but then we have this unclear picture of what is his strategy, what is his red line. Sometimes I'm given the impression that it's the reverse on the European side, in the sense that the strategy seems to be clear. The goal, however, is not as clear. Do the Europeans really want a deal, even if it means that they will not be at the table, even if it means that they may not be fully happy with some of the nuclear variables because they seem to have skepticism about Trump negotiating a good deal, and even if it means the rehabilitation of Russia internationally, since it likely will play an important role in this deal?
Hi, Trita, and thanks again for Quincy for hosting this discussion at a very critical time for these talks. Let me just, Vali, Trita, if I may, just respond to a couple of things Vali said first. I think it's been very unhelpful that, as Vali mentioned, these negotiations are taking place publicly. And Vali mentioned that these are creating pressure points in the domestic politics in Iran. It's also doing the same in the US side, because each time the negotiators or members of the administration say something, they are boxing themselves into a position that we have no idea whether President Trump wants to be boxed in or not. So it's I think, creating unhelpful dynamics in a relationship between Iran and the US, where where there's a lot of distrust and there's a lot of spoilers at play. So the less folks talk in public going forward on these technical issues, I think the better. Second, I think another aspect that's really hindering the momentum at the moment is the fact that these talks are still happening indirectly through, I think, good intended efforts by the Omanis to be the go-between. But I think that Tehran really needs to open itself up to more direct talks with the United States. This can fast-track negotiations, and it can also prevent any things getting lost in translation, literally, between the two sides. And that can, I think, be very helpful in setting some clear red lines for both the US side and the Iranian side directly. So I think this is a moment for Iran to really reconsider the dynamics around these indirect talks. And thirdly, another point that Vali mentioned is that there might be lulls going forward in these talks. And I think one thing we have to look for is after the next round of these negotiations, whether there's going to be a really long gap for the next round. And I think that would be bad news, because the longer the gaps, the more likely we are to get to a situation that the European countries do make a decision to move towards snapback. And that's going to be opening up a whole range of unknown factors at play. So let me answer your question, Triton, on do the Europeans want a deal? I think yes. Bottom line, they do want a diplomatic solution to the nuclear crisis with Iran, but I think they want a good enough deal. It's not about whether it's it's the optimal deal or if it's a bad deal, but I think they have certain technical standards and they want to try and push both sides towards that good enough package. And I think right now, the difficulty we're getting into about this zero enrichment question may be helped with certain technical ideas that the E3 have been testing out with the Iranians during several rounds of direct negotiations that they've had with the Iranians in the E3 Iran, EU Iran format over the past year. And so the good thing is that the Europeans have tested certain ideas with the Iranians. They know some technical solutions that might be helpful. So it may not be a bad thing at this stage for the US to listen more carefully to its E3 allies on some creative technical solutions. Having said that, I think that personally, if the E3 do head towards snapback, towards midsummer, this would not be beneficial to European interest. It could also derail the US-Iran track, and it could basically open up a escalatory dynamic whereby Israel sees that as now the opportune moment to drag US policy towards kinetic action rather than diplomacy, which has been going on.
Thank you so much, Ellie. And I want to come back to perhaps a longer conversation about the snapback, the calculations, the dynamics around it, because it is absolutely critical. But you mentioned something about the Iranians moving away from this indirect talk and moving towards something more direct. So I want to turn that to Mohsen. Mohsen, should Iran just simply invite Steve Witkov to Tehran and have a conversation with him there and explain to us the dynamics and the negotiation calculations the Iranians would have for either making that decision or rejecting it, as they have in so many other previous cases? You're on mute, Mohsen. You're still on mute.
All right. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Great, great. Terita, thank you very much for organizing this timely panel. And thank you for inviting me. It's always a great pleasure to be with Vali, my good friend, and with Ellie. And let me start answering your question by giving you a bigger picture that explains why suddenly we're talking about no enrichment for Iran. As you remember, President Bush tried to impose a no enrichment, no domestic enrichment, and Iran didn't agree with it. And finally, in 2015, President Obama agreed with an enrichment inside Iran. Now, all of a sudden, 10 years after, when Iran is already enriching uranium at 60%, they're talking about completely dismantling it. The question is why? What is behind that thinking? What is behind that thinking is the flawed assumption that because of what has happened to Iran's axis of resistance in the Middle East, because Assad is no longer there, because Hezbollah has been weakened, militarily weakened, and because the entire axis of resistance is demoralized and Iranian air defenses have been compromised, that its offensive capabilities is compromised. Therefore, as one person said yesterday, Iran today is at the weakest point since the 1979 revolution. To this, I say, hold your horse. It is a very simplistic way of explaining what is going on. Yes, the Iranian axis of resistance has suffered. It is bruised, but it is not broken. Yes, Iranian air defenses have been compromised, but Iran is still capable of defending itself and inflicting damage. And therefore, my conclusion is based on what the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, said today. He said very clearly, in a very clear language, that Iran will not accept no enrichment. He used a word in Persian language that I cannot translate in English. It means ghalat ziyadi. He said, we are not going to listen to what they say. It is our right. And therefore, my conclusion is, if the US insists on that, it is very unlikely that Iran agrees to go along with the negotiation. And part of the problem for the Islamic Republic, again, is the mindset that Ayatollah Khamenei has. And the mindset is very simple. If we agree to dismantle our entire enrichment activities, what is going to come next? Dismantling our missiles. And then what is going to come next? Ending our support for Iranian allies in the Middle East. And what is going to come next? Regime change. And therefore, Iran is going to look at that enrichment at the point where either the US has compromised or, as I think, as Vali correctly said, we might see the end of this round of negotiation between Iran and the United States. But let me end by saying this. From the very beginning, I said it is a mistake. It is a huge mistake for Iran not to deal with the US directly. They should have dealt with the US directly. And I also believe, even if we reach an agreement over uranium enrichment in Iran, as long as Iran does not reform its regional policies, we're going to see this movie again and again and again. And therefore, it's high time for the Iranians to revise their anti-American and anti-Israeli policy in the Middle East.
Thank you so much, Mohsen. Should they invite Witkov to Tehran?
That, I think, depends on whether they insist on no enrichment. If they insist on no enrichment, absolutely not. But if they do compromise on that, not only they should invite him, they should invite others. I don't see any problem when the Russians and the Chinese, that are Iran's greatest so-called supporters, they deal with the United States day and night. Why not Iran? We have to break this taboo. Oh, we cannot talk to the US. Go ahead and talk. Don't be afraid of talking. Invite him or invite even people who are higher than him.
So essentially what you're saying, Mohsen, is that the no direct dialogue policy of Iran is as unproductive as the no enrichment policy of the United States. Vali, on that point, do you agree that Iran simply will not compromise on enrichment? And if it doesn't, can it compromise on some of these other ideas that have been floating around, such as a temporary halt of the enrichment, whether that temporary timeline is a couple of weeks or all the way up to 3 years, meaning the rest of the Trump presidency? Is that also off the table, or is there potential movement there?
I mean, to Mohsen's point and to Ellie's point both, I mean, one is the issue of, talking about these things in public boxes both sides in. So in part, Iran cannot accept zero enrichment as it is being dictated publicly by either the Secretary of State or Witkov or by President Trump, because that essentially is a demand for Iran to surrender, if you would, which they cannot do the way that it's being presented to them. On the other hand, you could say that, as Mohsen says, there are these worries about what does agreeing to dismantlement mean? Is it a first step towards something bigger? That part can be mitigated, if you would, through some kinds of innovative language that suggests that, I mean, these ideas that are being floated, like agreeing to zero enrichment for a period of time, I don't think it's going to be easy. But but it's not out of the realm of possibility that both sides want to be able to declare victory, and you could think creatively of formulas that allows each side to say that they got what they wanted, that Iran actually did not agree to dismantlement, did not agree to actually surrender. On the other side, President Trump has to say that he got something bigger than the 2015 deal, that this is not just JCPOA, that the fundamental parameter of how much enrichment Iran would do is at least formulated differently. But you know, I would say that actually on the US side, and that I worry about it, that actually needs really seasoned, good, creative diplomats. And that's lacking, right? You know, these kind of grand declarations are good, but who's going to bring it home? Right? Who is the seasoned diplomat who is actually going to be negotiating that? When I look at Witkov's team or at he himself, I don't see that kind of expertise and commitment and knowledge of diplomacy and the material to actually formulate something like that.
May I just add something to what Vali was saying? Today is the first day that, or yesterday in Tehran's time, is the first time that I've heard Ayatollah Khamenei specifically and explicitly talking about we are not going to agree with no enrichment. Now, if we assume, let's assume for a moment, we don't know what is going on behind the closed door, but let's assume that the American side proposed that to the Iranians. No enrichment, zero. Let's go back to the Bush, the Sun era. Let's assume they proposed that. Isn't that interesting that Ayatollah Khamenei was silent until today? That should send a signal to the Americans that what they might be able to do privately, they're not going to be able to do publicly, because there is a core supporter for Ayatollah Khamenei who opposes this kind of capitulation. The same way that President Trump rightly is concerned about his base, and that's one of the reasons he doesn't want to start a war, because a good portion of his base is sick and tired of these endless war. The same way that he's concerned about this, he should be told, he should be convinced that there is also a powerful constituency that is the basis of Ayatollah Khamenei's support rule in Iran. And he has to explain that, he has to justify that to them. So I hope they restart their negotiation behind closed door rather than making these comments, which then forces Iran to make comments and make things extremely difficult.
Ellie, you want to jump in on enrichment?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, Steve Witkov has often talked about the fact that when you're sitting down to negotiate with an adversary, you need to understand where their mindset is. So I'm not going to get into whether this is right or wrong from Iran's perspective, but in addition to what Mohsen said about the relevance of not accepting zero enrichment and capitulation, I think there's a couple of important messages that have to be relayed to the American side. One is that, you know, Iran really does feel that it has paid a huge cost for its right to enrich on its own soil. It has not only paid billions in actually setting up the infrastructure, but it has paid billions in sanctions that were imposed on it and the loss of oil sales. And it has, you know, what Iranian officials have called paid with blood. And that's in reference to scientists that have been assassinated throughout the course of the last few decades on working on this program. Another big important issue for Iran is that this program and the right for enrichment for civil nuclear purposes has now become an issue of national pride. It's almost akin, in my view, of Iran's nationalization of oil. Again, they have paid a huge cost. There's a lot of dispute, I think, amongst ordinary Iranians whether that was worth it. But I think at the leadership level, this is now striking a real national pride issue. So to think that Iran would give it up after paying all these costs when it's become a strategic national security issue, I think is really foolish. The next issue is that if you look at where Iran's position is in the region, Pakistan is a nuclear weapon state. Israel is a nuclear weapon state. Turkey, another neighbor, is a NATO ally. And Iran has always felt that it is strategically alone, that it cannot rely on any external powers, and that having this nuclear program as a sort of deterrent of sort of pushing against any ideas of regime change from external actors is an important tool to have remaining. And finally, this idea that Secretary of State Rubio has been floating of why can't Iran just accept a UAE-style model 1, 2, 3 agreement of bringing in and importing uranium enriched from abroad. And that's because Iran has tried and tested this, and it hasn't worked. It hasn't paid off. Countries have not delivered on multiple occasions. So it just simply doesn't feel like it can trust in that sort of a arrangement. But I do think that there is a way to thread the needle on this issue of zero enrichment. And again, I'll go back to sort of piping up that the E3 have interesting creative ideas around this issue, and that's where the technical expertise that Vali was referring to may be plugged through some European support. And if you look at some of the statements that have come out from the US and Iran, it's not inconsistent to say that Iran will stop enriching uranium for weaponization while also allowing Iran to enrich for civil nuclear purposes. And on this issue of can Iran for a period of time agree to halt enrichment, I think, again, it's not an outlandish idea, but the devil is going to be in the detail. Firstly, how long? Is it just going to be for the period of negotiations, for the period of implementation, which I think may be more doable than saying a prolonged, like years-long restriction on this front? And what does Iran get in return? It will require an upfront delivery of economic benefit from the US side for this halt. And so the question is, are the Americans willing to deliver on that front? Thanks.
So can I just add quickly? I think Ellie's points are all very well taken, but I would just add to it that, agreeing to zero enrichment, the way the United States putting it forward, basically defies Iran's rights under non-proliferation treaty to be able to do enrichment on its soil. If Iran were to agree to that, that fundamentally means that Iran accepts that is an exception state in the world, that it can be signatory to an international treaty, but not be treated equal to other members of that treaty. And I think that's an important psychological issue. It's more than just national pride, but it goes to national pride. In other words, it means that the country has to accept that willingly accept that it's going to be treated other than all the other citizens of the international community. So it cannot be a permanent circumstance. I think a temporary solution, like Ellie says, is correct. Secondly, on the comparison with UAE, I think it's problematic for Secretary Rubio to say that, because Saudi Arabia actually wants native enrichment as part of its civilian nuclear deal. And if the United States were to insist on Iran having no enrichment, then either it has to insist on the same thing with Saudi Arabia, or if it gives that to Saudi Arabia and insists on not giving it to Iran, it further underscores this issue that Iran has to be treated as a separate entity in the international order. And I think that has secondary, tertiary orders of ramification for Iran if it was to willingly accept that status.
Thank you so much, Vali. If I could jump in, Mohsen, because I want to add a question to you based on what Vali and Ellie have said here, making Iran an exception, whether it is particularly when it comes to limitations to its program in perpetuity, which is not just limitations on enrichment. But we have a question from Linta Gunter who says, okay, fine, but why does Iran have to enrich at 20%, at 60%, if it is retaining the right to enrich, to be able to produce fuel for its own domestic civilian production. Okay, understand why they insist on that. But Iran is going way beyond that. So how do we explain that, Mohsen?
Yes, but before I try to respond to this, I think Ellie and Vali pretty much destroyed this argument that Iran should follow the UAE model. Now, let me also destroy another model that has been talked about, and that's the Libyan model. You have heard people who are in favor of complete dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program saying, look, we did it with Muammar Gaddafi. Why not for Iran? I did a little bit of a study about the status of Muammar Gaddafi's nuclear program. And here is my short summary. It was his dream, his ambitions. There was very little infrastructure for what he was planning to do. So what happened in the Libyan model? We destroyed a dream. We destroyed an ambition. In Iran today, we have enrichment at 60% capacity. There are thousands of people who are connected to this industry. And to make the comparison with Libya is misunderstanding what is going on in Iran and misunderstanding what actually happened in Libya. Now, regarding the key question, why Iran is doing 60%, I have always believed, and I continue to believe, that Iran's nuclear program was based on turning Iran into a potential nuclear power. That is a power that has the infrastructure, the expertise to develop a bomb should they decide to develop a bomb. I have been saying that for over 12 years, and I'm not going to change my view today. I think Iran is very close to that, much closer to it than it has ever been. And therefore, this is part of Iran's defense doctrine. However, and here is the key, nuclear program, Iran's nuclear program, and this goes back to the assumption that a lot of people have that Iran has been so weakened that we can dictate to Iran. Iran's nuclear program has never been the central part of Iran's defense posture, nor has the axis of resistance. These are secondary and tertiary aspects. The key part of Iranian defense strategy, it is missiles, its drones, and its asymmetrical war strategy. And therefore, what Iran is doing now is to make sure that it can keep that option should there be a need for it. And President Trump is trying to go beyond weaponization is because they want to make sure that Iran is incapable of doing what it has tried to do for the past 20 years.
Very interesting. I want to shift it to the conversation about Snapback, because as you're talking about Iran's defense strategy, etc., we may end up in a scenario if all of this falls apart in which there might be a military confrontation. I want to get to that scenario. But before, let's talk about the Snapback. Ellie, the Europeans are the ones who can trigger it because they're still actually part of the JCPOA. Trump left the JCPOA and as a result does not have the legal ability to trigger it any longer. Here's what I don't understand. What is the strategy behind it? Because earlier on, when there were talks about imposing Chapter 7 UN Security Council sanctions on Iran, etc., there was at least a bit of a theory of thinking this pressure will force Iran to the table or it will force Iran to compromise. When it comes to Snapback, a reimposition of all of those old UN sanctions, the Iranians have said that they're going to walk out of the NPT, not just the JCPOA, if that happens. We're talking about a major crisis. How does that help actually getting to where Europe says that he wants to be, which is to have some deal that limits Iran's nuclear program?
Sure. So let me just outline quickly that the E3 snapback would essentially, as you've said, put back UN nuclear-related sanctions that were agreed at the Security Council that are due to expire in October. And they would also, by the way, automatically put back EU sanctions. And that's something that we sometimes forget, which although there isn't a huge amount of trade happening between Iran and the EU market at the moment, should there be a deal between the US and Iran, you can see that in a situation where EU sanctions have snapped back, it would require a unanimous vote amongst the council members to lift those sanctions again, which isn't a certainty under the current conditions because of a lot of areas of disagreements between European countries and Iran on non-nuclear related issues, including human rights, detention of citizens, and what Europeans call state threats from Iran directly on their soil. So that's one key issue to remember about the practical impact of snapback. Now, for the European side, there is a sort of use it or lose it dilemma at the moment. So they have right now really basically up to middle of August where they could trigger the process, the mechanism for snapback to begin. And although the snapback doesn't expire till mid-October, the presidency of the UN Security Council will be under Russian purview in September. And so the Europeans don't want to get in a procedural sort of a nightmare with the Russians if they do want to snap back. Now, the point of snapback at the moment, and I think the power of it, is a threat. That's the biggest leverage that they have, is to threaten Iran that they will go ahead with snapback should it not make concessions at the negotiating table with the US. And by the way, another way that the Europeans could use the threat of snapback is if Iran delivers more lethal weapons to Russia. And that's another area of direct security threat for the Europeans that they have really drawn as a red line from the Iranians. So right now, that sort of threat is a sword that hangs over Iran's head. And the Europeans can use this to sort of induce good behavior from the Iranian side, potentially induce concessions. But once they trigger it and sort of use it, they will lose that power, and they will probably set in motion a very escalatory pathway with Iran. Iran has very clearly stated in public and private that it would, on the same day as the Europeans trigger snapback mechanism, they would also put in play notice to withdraw from the NPT treaty. Now, there is, one optimistic way to view this scenario. In my view, it's a huge gamble and that it will likely set in motion an escalation path. But if you want to see it as a more optimistic scenario, you could say that actually there is a timeline that is triggered by both Iran's decision to withdraw from the NPT and the E3 snapback. And that is a period of, a couple of months, 2 to 3 months, where these two tracks are in play. And that may force both the US and Iran to really zoom in and focus on creating a breakthrough on the diplomatic track in a way that then the E3 can basically withdraw snapback and the Iranians can withdraw their NPT withdrawal. Now, this is the most optimistic scenario that this could play out. I don't think it will, but this is one way to read it, especially if the E3 communicate very clearly to both Washington and Tehran that their purpose for triggering it is not to create escalation, but to actually focus diplomatic minds on a solution. Now, there is another pathway that's open, and I think this is only really realistic if there is real progress being made by the US and Iran in these political tracks, which is for the E3 to say, look, we haven't gotten to a new nuclear deal. We are not willing to give up our ability to snap back sanctions and punish Iran if these negotiations fail or hit a dead end. And so there might be ways to negotiate a one-time short-term extension to the snapback mechanism. A lot of work needs to be done on this, but this is one way to thread this needle and avoid a sort of dilemma come August.
But Ellie, in that scenario, the US and all of these countries need to negotiate a new Security Council resolution, and the Europeans and the Russians need to be on board, and they need to set aside and pretend as if Ukraine has not happened. What are the prospects of that actually happening, given how sour the relationship currently is between the EU and Russia, which was not at all the case when the JCPOA was negotiated?
So absolutely right. The dynamics, as you know well, Trita, at the Security Council are at rock bottom at the moment on a number of issues. The question is whether the E3 are able to put aside those differences with Russia for this, especially if, for example, the Trump administration asks the Europeans to give more political space to this track of talks with the Iranians. The Europeans and the Americans would need to agree between themselves that this is the right path, and that's a big question mark. And then it will be up to Iran to really convince the Russians to play ball on this and not to sort of poison the new Security Council resolution that would be required. I said this is a very risky road to go down. It's not optimal, but I also don't see the Europeans being willing to give up Snapback and just let it bypass in October if there isn't a real tangible deal on the table between the US and Iran. That's good enough for the European security interests.
Vali, come in and tell me also, in addition to what you're planning to say, do you think the European calculation that Iran is bluffing when it says that it will walk out of the NPT is true? Or do you think they actually will, given the new circumstances as well as the heightened tensions between Russia and China, which Tehran probably calculates will lead to less of a problem with Russia and China if the Iranians walk out of the NPT?
I think there's a solid ground to say that you could say that Iran might be bluffing, or in the scenario that Ellie said, that they may put the notification in, but whether they actually pull the trigger is a whole different issue. But you know, we end up, if things go south, we end up in a completely in an area nobody knows what might happen. And you know, calculations may be wrong on both sides in terms of the steps they're going to take, because you're going to have an escalatory process that then find a mind of its own. What I wanted to add to Ellie's excellent analysis of you know, how Snapback plays in in European-Iranian relations, it is also possible to see that it's a problem in the US-European relations right now. Because think of scenarios that either these talks are progressing, but they're not going to be concluded necessarily by July or even August, or we have small lulls and moving forward. Then the issue of whether or not Europe exercises Snapback is also pressure on the Trump administration, not on Iran. Because if Trump wants a deal and the Europeans are creating limitations on the scope of time, then the question is not that Snapback is leverage against Iran. It becomes a problem in transatlantic relations. I mean, as we're talking, the Iranians and you could say the Trump administration were in a hurry to close this deal by end of May, because there's a board of governors meeting at the IAEA in June. If Iran would have got a positive review there, that would have been the basis to back away from Snapback. And it's been months since the Europeans are saying that the key decision about moving forward with Snapback would happen in June. Well, we're almost in June, and neither Iran nor the US are ready to call it quits. And talks may go on for 2-3 more sessions. And in fact, Iran may find reason to continue to meet Americans, regardless of any red lines being violated, because it keeps the talks going. And then the real question for me becomes whether it's Trump that leans on the Europeans on the Snapback issue, as opposed to Iranians leaning on them. And I would add, right now, I mean, Iranians are trying more to engage the Europeans on the nuclear issue than the Americans are. I mean, the Americans are not taking on board European concerns like the issue of Iranian actions on their soil or giving missiles to Europe, to Ukraine in the talks, and are not actually even briefing them. They're not even briefing Europe on most of these contacts with Iran. So that's an added dimension here.
Very interesting. Mohsen, we have a question from Jamshid Jamshidi at Oxford University, who's asking at what conditions would we actually see Iran move towards weaponization? You laid out that these elements are actually not core to Iran's national security strategy, missiles, drones, etc. are. But we have seen a significant hardening of the debate in Iran around the very issue of weaponization, in which the taboo of even coming out publicly and favoring weaponization rather than negotiating away the nuclear leverage seems to have shifted in a rather dramatic way. Do you see Iran actually moving in that direction, and what would be the trigger for that? What would be the conditions?
Well, at this time, I do not see Iran moving in that direction. But you're absolutely right. The language that the Iranian elites, as well as the supporters of the Islamic Republic, are using today are fundamentally different than it was 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, before October, Hamas's October attack. The argument they make is that the Iranian deterrence has been weakened. And the only way we can restore that deterrence in the Middle East is by moving toward weaponization. But as you know, Ayatollah Khamenei has opposed that, partly because he said of his religious views, but also because he knows that if Iran moves in that direction, there could be serious retaliation by the US and by Israel. And therefore, he is pursuing the same policy that he has had toward the US for many years: no peace and no war, somewhere in between. And I think he's trying to do the same thing with Iran's nuclear program. It's going to be up to the next supreme leader to make, if there is one, to make that decision. But under what conditions? It's hard to say, but I can imagine one condition. If Iran is attacked and there is massive casualties, then I think there is that possibility that whoever is in Iran in charge in that direction. But also, what is unknown, there are some unknown. And the unknown for me is how close Iran actually is to weaponization. I've heard people say Iran can build a bomb in 2 weeks. It's hard for me to believe that. And I've heard that they can develop a bomb, build a bomb in 6 months. I don't know which one is true. But that would be the key question. How close is Iran? But the conditions, Iran is attacked, or the sanctions, maximum pressure sanctions, start stopping Iranian oil tankers, and Iran has zero income from its oil, and there is economic pressure in Iran, then I think the leadership in Iran might change its position and take the dangerous route of moving toward weaponization. But at this time, I just don't see Iran moving in that direction.
What would the Iranian public's reaction be to all of this? We have a question from Moja, who points out that the regime is very, very unpopular at the end of the day inside of Iran. We have Shibli Telhami, Professor Telhami, pointing out that his recent poll shows that, on the other hand, there's only 14% support amongst the American public for military action against Iran, a very, very strong level of support for diplomacy. How would this play out internally in Iran if Iran is attacked and goes for weaponization?
One thing that in the discussion about Iran's weakness or Iran's vulnerability, what is not being discussed is that the US also has its own limitation today. Starting a war against Iran is going to be quite problematic for economic recovery. It's going to undermine what the Saudis and the Kuwaitis are doing in the region. And therefore, it's not just that Iran has limitation, but also the US has limitation. But regarding the public, I haven't traveled to Iran for a number of years. I don't know. But based on what my conversation with the number of Iranians who have gone to Iran, they tell me Iran has become a very polarized society. A significant portion of the Iranian population has filed a divorce against the Islamic Republic. They're going their own way. But I don't think the Islamic Republic makes its strategic decision based on what the public thinks. I think there is a core support for the Islamic Republic, a core support that has been shrinking over the years. If they conclude that that core is supportive of their strategy, then they're going to pursue. Remember one thing, I have said that and I have written about it. There is more discontent in Iran today than it was a few years before the fall of the Pahlavi regime in 1979. The difference, though, is that we have a regime that has a core, a significant portion of the population that supports the government, which we did not have at that time. The Iranian government has shown its ability to suppress when its survival is threatened, and also the opposition to the Islamic Republic. This is the greatest gift that I think God has given to the Islamic Republic. We have a disorganized, disjointed opposition, both inside and outside. And when you put these two together, an unorganized opposition without vision, without a strategy, and a large middle class that is afraid of Iran going through what Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Libya went through, and then you have a government that has retained its suppressive capability, you get to where you are. And that's the position that the Islamic Republic has found itself in today.
Can I just add to one additional point to what Mohsen said, is that it's very clear that, as Mohsen said, there's a significant amount of the population that dislikes and opposes the Islamic Republic. But that doesn't mean that they don't love their country. There's a difference between, in their minds in particular, difference between the regime and the country. And then there are those Iranians for whom there is no difference between the regime and the country. There's also a big difference with opposing Iran's expenditures in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, as these sort of outlandish projects of the Islamic Republic. It's a different thing if your country is attacked. And the sort of opposition the Iranians have to support of Hezbollah, Assad, Hamas, etc., may not parlay if actually Israel or the US attack Iran. And then the second question is, under what conditions do they attack Iran, right? Is it unprovoked attack or is it provoked attack? Does Iran do something to deserve retaliation? Or it looks to the population that Iran went to the table, was willing to sign a deal, and then US and Israel perhaps scuttled the deal. There was snapback, the country is being unfairly treated, and then it's attacked. I think issue of casualties is pretty important, as Mohsen said, because there's one thing that if a bomb hits a base and nobody sees it, and there's another thing if actually there are casualties. So I think how Iranians would react to actually being attacked, actually the country being attacked, nobody knows. And the protests of 2023 or Iranians' opposition to adventurism in the Levant, to me, is not indicative of necessarily of how they would react if their country was in war and was being attacked from the outside.
May I also add to what Vali added to what I had said, and that is, if you go back to 1980, August of 1980, a month before Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, Iran had no military. The top echelon of the Iranian armed forces were either killed or were in exile. There was total chaos in Iran. And Saddam Hussein's calculation was precisely what the calculation of some people are today, that Iran has become so weakened that this is going to give us an opportunity to once and for all finish the job with our great enemies, the Persians. And the minute Iraq invaded Iran, that very moment, every calculation changed in Iran. Now, of course, there are a lot of people who oppose the Islamic Republic. But as Vali correctly said, the day after the bomb is dropped, the calculations are going to be very different. And should Iran be attacked, and should Iran decide to retaliate, I think it's very important for the folks in Washington to think about this scenario. The Russians and the Chinese definitely are not going to defend Iran, but they are going to find a fantastic opportunity to provide support to Iran to prolong a confrontation between the US and Iran, which I believe will not serve the interests of Iran or the interests of the United States.
Thank you, Mohsen. Ellie, please come in.
Hi, Trita. I'll try and be quick because I know we're wrapping up soon. But let me just mention that I do think that both President Trump and Ayatollah Khamenei have stepped back from the brink of this military confrontation. And I think simply one of the biggest reasons is that such a confrontation, if the US is seriously invested in it, is going to take multiple rounds of bombing campaigns to try and really deplete Iranian nuclear facilities and resources and its missile capabilities, which I think is the number one threat at the moment to Israeli security from the Israeli perspective. So this would really overshadow the last few years of the Trump administration and potentially the last few years of Khamenei, when there might be a succession issue. And this is a sort of disaster zone that both men, I think, have rightly stepped back from, let alone the sort of cost of such a conflict, both to US military capacities. Just look at the military campaign against the Houthis and the costs involved for that. You would have to multiply it, I don't know by how many folds on the Iranian example, but also the human cost in Iran is something that I think needs to be considered. Now, one thing that was really interesting to me, despite all the adversarial messaging and tones from Trump during his visit to the GCC states, was that he was putting on the table a really different vision for Iran and the Iranian public. Really putting in play a comparison between the fact that the GCC states had built these immense world-leading economies in the desert, while the Iranian population was dealing with drought and electricity shortages. And that even Syria, which has a government in place that was till recently under immense sanctions, terrorist listing by the United States. The Trump administration announced the cessation of sanctions against Syria. And I think, again, this is something that will hit a chord and hit a nerve amongst the Iranian public of why are the Arab countries accelerating in this degree, whereas we are left behind? And I think this is something that the Iranian leadership will have to think very deeply about as it calculates its option going forward.
You're quite right. The public will look at that and probably be quite upset and probably tilt towards blaming the regime for the continuation of the sanctions if they believe that the negotiations could have been more successful if Iran had adopted a different position. But Vali, how will the regime see Trump's declaration that all sanctions on Syria is going to be lifted? Will they read that as something that indicates Trump's closeness to groups that are affiliated with Al-Qaeda, or will they see that as here's an example of Trump being willing to do things that no other president in the United States is willing to do in terms of sanctions relief, and as a result have greater confidence that a deal with the United States actually can bear fruit?
I think it's the latter. Yes, of course, they realize that this has happened because the King of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and the President of Turkey pushed for it. But at the same time, they did deliver. And we're at a time when all of the Gulf countries are also promising Iran that they can deliver positive things if you engage with Washington. So this is proof. They actually got Trump to go against Israel's wishes as well as the wishes of the neocons and actually meet with the Syrian president and then promise that I'm going to lift all sanctions. So that promise in of itself is something new for an American president to do. Now, the key question becomes, will he actually be able to do it? And I think they're watching this very carefully. And I think all the Syria case is a positive impetus in this conversation. Yes, they're getting bogged down in all kinds of technicalities, pride, red lines, etc. But I think the bottom line after JCPOA and Iran's experience with JCPOA, and it's not just that the United States left JCPOA, it's that even when it was in JCPOA, it didn't actually implement much of what it had promised in 2015. So I think the most important thing for Iran is two things. Is that if they sign a deal, will the US actually implement it? And will the US actually stay in the deal? And these are the two things that they asked and pushed the Biden administration in Vienna as well. Now, you don't know if Trump will stay in the deal or if the next president will stay in the deal. But at least the first part of this, which is that will he be willing and able to actually lift a lot of sanctions? I think that's a very important thing the Iranians are watching. And I'll take you back to what Ellie said at the very beginning, that if the United States wants some big concessions from Iran on red line issues, it has to be able to deliver upfront pretty big as well. And that really comes down to, can Trump do it? He might be the only American president who has the courage or the wiliness, if you would, to play outside of Washington's red lines. But I think the key question is, in the next 2-3 months, what does Syria have to show for that meeting?
Thank you all for an absolutely excellent conversation. Thank you, Mohsen, Vali, Ellie. This was very much helping bring light to a lot of very complex issues, and also a realization of that there is a path to a deal. It's not necessarily the path we're currently on, but there's possibilities to be able to shift back to that path. We will have more conversations about this, of course, going forward. As I mentioned earlier on, 2 book talks with Vali and with Mohsen on their books. But I also want to mention our next webinar before all of you leave, which is going to be tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. It will be a book talk on Paul Bluestein's book, King Dollar, The Past and the Future of the World's Dominant Currency, which is actually very relevant to this conversation as well, since U.S. sanctions, financial sanctions,
for those of you who are not subscribed to the Quincy Institute mailing list, please go to quincyinst.org, sign up for the mailing list so that you will receive invitations to all of our webinars, as well as receive all of our reports, briefs, and other types of products. For that, thank you all so much, and hope to see you all soon.